So much has changed in the workplace since the COVID pandemic began. If you have been affected as an employee, whether it's through a furlough, reduced work hours, or a layoff, and now it's about returning to a safe work environment, it's important to know what your legal rights are, what you have to do, and what you should avoid. In today's episode of Asked and Answered. Hello, everybody. This is Richard Wong with Viridian Mortgage, and we're joined today by Susan Bluer, owner of Bluer Bluer in San Francisco. So Susan is an employee side attorney with over 25 years, handling matters involving like offer letters, severance agreements, as well as the mediation, arbitration, and litigation involved if her clients get really serious. Susan, welcome. Thank you for spending time to join me today. We have some really relevant questions that I think our watchers can take a lot from during this pandemic that we're going through right now. First of all, how are you, and what has changed in your business so far, that's related to the pandemic?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for including me, Richard. Sheltering in place is not an easy thing for an extrovert. So on a personal level, this has had its challenges, but professionally, I have been doing quite a few of my phone calls with clients, on a remote basis. I have offices in San Francisco. People don't always want to commute into the city. I also have clients who are sometimes located in other states or even other countries, but have a connection to a California employer. And so I'm familiar with the issues that come up with remote work, for that reason. But nevertheless, even though I'm able to provide a seamless level of service as I always have remotely, I'm having to deal with many, many new issues. There's a host of new laws. We're going to be talking about some of those. And there's quite a few issues related to people getting furloughed and laid off.
Sure. I mean, just like right off the bat, what are some of the most common questions that you've been asked so far?
I would say they fall into a few buckets. One is for people who are required to go to work and show up in a workplace, and they're afraid to do that. Do they have to do that? Lots of issues around people who might have disability that could put them at a heightened risk. Even with the shelter-in-place laws, as you know, there are a lot of exceptions for employers that are deemed to be essential, whether they're in the food services or other supply chain type jobs. So I have a lot of questions along those lines. I have a lot of people who are being let go and need me to review their severance agreements. And then I would say there's another bucket of people who have issues related to changes in their job as a result of COVID. Maybe there's a pay cut, or they're being asked to work part-time, or there may be something comes up with what it's like to work remotely if you've got kids at home and how that looks. So the issues cross a lot of lines.
You've been a busy gal.
I've been a busy gal. I feel like I was made for this moment, truly, though, because I've been doing employment law, as you said, for well over 25 years. And, I have a grasp of all the laws that have been with us for a long time. And I understand the rationale behind some of these new laws, the expansion of paid leave and, things like that. Laws, of course, that impact discrimination and harassment. People are scared, and that's not an uncommon thing for me. When I'm dealing with a new client, very often they're coming to me in a very emotional place. It's not that different from somebody who's been arrested or somebody who's going through a divorce. They're often talking to a lawyer for one of the first times in their lives, and they need somebody who can show some empathy.
Right. Well, let's start with some of the essential businesses and essential workers that you referenced earlier. So let's say, obviously, the frontline health workers who have to go and help the people who are sick, and then there's also the bankers, and then the people in the grocery stores we all know about. But what about some of the other essential workers, like an auto mechanic, or maybe some people in the medical profession not considered urgent, like maybe a dentist? Like, what if they're required to go back to work During this time, what's your advice to them right now? And if they don't feel safe, what can they do? What are their options?
Right. So, one of the issues is around PPE. As we know, there's been a shortage of PPE. You can pretty much forget getting an N95 mask if you're not, in a frontline position.
Or pay $40 for one on the black market.
Right. So, and then you're in a position of reusing it, right? Because you're not really supposed to reuse those, and that makes them less safe. So, I would say, when people are going back to work, they do have rights to talk to their employer about what they need to be safe. I dealt just specifically yesterday with somebody who asked her employer to get some plexiglass, because we're seeing how in grocery stores that's becoming very commonplace. Well, this person's in a customer service role in a campus environment, and she's got an autoimmune disorder. So, we're dealing with all kinds of reasonable accommodation issues related to that. If you have to spend your own money to get masks or hand sanitizer or wipes, that should be submitted as a business expense. There's a labor code section, 2802, that basically says, anything that's a business expense has to be paid by the employer.
Got it. And even if you're an employee who's asymptomatic, you're feeling fine, are those things that you can request?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because unfortunately, everybody is at risk from, the person that's in the room with them, because you don't know if that person who may seem healthy is in fact a carrier. I mean, we're seeing what's going on in the White House right now. I mean, we all know that if Trump had a sense that his valet was, is it valet or valet? I forget what the appropriate pronunciation is, but
I always say valet.
Yeah, if that guy had shown that he was ill, he would have gotten the boot. But obviously he was walking around feeling fine. And, this is what's happening. And this is why this virus is something, none of us have seen before in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now what about the employee who has been handed a pink slip or who has been significantly furloughed? What remedies do they have at this point?
Well, I want to treat those in two different buckets. I actually want to talk first. I have some information that I can just share briefly here. For furloughed employees, one of the issues that comes up is were they paid their vacation? A lot of times they're treated like a terminated employee and paid out their vacation. And so let's say somebody comes back, whether it's been characterized as a furlough or layoff, they come back and all of a sudden they have no vacation and no sick leave because that's been zeroed out. So that's one of the things that is becoming an area of inquiry among employment lawyers as to what's the right way to deal with that. And what most of us are saying is that vacation, once it's paid out, technically they probably will have to accrue again. But sick leave, there's some law out there that seems to indicate that once somebody has accrued some of that sick leave, you don't get paid out when you leave, but if you get returned back to work within that same year, you should still be able to have your balance. And then under the, these different CARES Acts, there's the emergency paid sick leave law that's under the federal laws, and that would, be something as well for someone who's coming back to work and wondering, what do I do if I do get ill?
But a lot of times you don't even know if you're coming back to work, right? Because there's such a fuzzy line between, okay, let's call it a furlough, but then we don't have a return date necessarily, right? I mean, is there a technical definition of a furlough?
So the difference with a furlough is that the intention at the time is to bring somebody back, whereas a layoff is a total severing. You may or may not ask them to come back, but there's not the same intent. Now, in terms of obligation, when somebody's at will, of course, they can be terminated for any reason that's not a legal reason, such as discrimination or harassment or retaliation. So if somebody's been furloughed thinking, hey, I'm going to be able to come back after the shelter-in-place orders lifted, and we've seen that these orders have gone a lot longer than anybody thought, if that employer can show that they had a legitimate business reason to change things in terms of the furlough intention and actually say, sorry, this is now a layoff, there's nothing illegal about that as long as they're not targeting people for an improper reason.
Sure. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of companies will have to come to that difficult decision at some point. And speaking of returning to the workplace, now with things sort of opening up around the country and in California, what issues do you see, and what issues do you think you can advise employees who are returning to the workplace now?
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about, too much yet is the issue of remote work. I believe that because we're unlikely to see a vaccination, that's going to go through trials and the like for a year from now, that I think the governments are going to say, okay, we're lifting the shelter in place, but those of you that can still work remotely, we want you to do that. We want to keep that curve as flat as possible. And so that becomes very important, whether we're talking now, Richard, or once the shelter in place orders are lifted, in terms of how are non-exempt employees being treated. So a non-exempt employee means somebody who, in fact, is not exempt from the different wage laws. And what are the big ones? We don't have time to go into all of them, but just very briefly, overtime, meal periods, rest periods. Those are the biggies. That person is entitled to still get those breaks, okay? They're entitled to get overtime. They're entitled to get, time off the clock, right? That they're actually doing work. And the other thing they're entitled to is to have their employer, if they're not already doing it, pay for things like their internet, even their devices, if the devices, are needed. So there's going to be some really interesting new issues that have been addressed in some ways with telecommuting, but now it's being done en masse, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Just little things like creating a home office. A lot of people don't have home offices.
That's right. And in San Francisco, I watch people on our Zoom calls together in our networking group, and you could tell the people that are kind of winging it, right, versus the people who actually have a good space developed.
Right. Exactly. Great. Okay. What are some mistakes that you see that employees are making right now? What are some of the biggest mistakes that they're making?
Now, did you say employees or employers?
Employees.
Okay. What are mistakes employees are making? Well, sadly, one of the biggest ones is feeling pressure to go to work when they shouldn't be. This is something we know is rampant among hourly workers, lower wage workers. Maybe they're working at a McDonald's or a pizza parlor or something like that, and they're afraid that if they don't go, they're not going to be able to pay their bills, because we live in a culture where people are already paycheck to paycheck. I hate to blame the victim, because it's definitely a systemic issue. It's not something that's really all the employees' fault, but there is some responsibility that we all have to not get other people sick. So I think that's one thing, is to really stay home when you're sick, and to know that there are new programs out there that are available. Also, for people who have the option of working something out with their employer to actually be furloughed, the unemployment benefits are now finally a livable wage in California. It used to be it maxed out at $450 a week, but with the stimulus money of $600 on top of that, that's $1,050 a week. I mean, for most people, especially if they have a spouse that's doing the same thing, but even without, that's more decent money that you can kind of figure out a way to get by, especially if there's relief on rent and mortgage and stuff like that, which there is a pressure point right now. We don't know where it's going to play out in terms of whether this will truly be forgiven money, right, or just deferred. It's funny. I feel like there are many people out there that think what we're dealing with now is somehow we're in the middle or the end. I feel like we're still at the beginning of so many things that are going to be shoes dropping for the different economic issues.
My next question was just for employees now who are returning to the workplace or thinking about returning to the workplace, what should they know, whether or not their employers have implemented social distancing guidelines or not, or even like changed the floor plan of the workplace? What should they be looking for?
Well, this issue is so timely, because just yesterday I talked to a client who said that he had the ability, he's a manager in a construction type site, and he had the ability to look remotely at the job site that had just opened the late April timeframe. And he could see that even though the employer said social distancing, wear masks, people weren't doing it. And he said he wasn't comfortable coming to the site, and he got fired. And that's why he's calling me. This is something that we're going to see a lot of. And in my opinion, these are going to amount to what we call a wrongful termination in violation of public policy. So you have to show as an employee that there's actually a law and that you were fired for, bringing to your employer's attention that that law was not being followed. And at this point, we've been told by the CDC, right, how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. And I think that that's going to be a basis for a lot of retaliation cases. Retaliation, interestingly, is sometimes easier to prove than discrimination, because discrimination, the employer can say, hey, we hired you and we knew you were a member of this particular protected class. But retaliation is all about what happens after you started working there. And when you've raised a concern that is inconvenient, right? An inconvenient truth for the employer, that they want to put the money before the process. It's not uncommon to see terminations. So that's one of the big things that employees need to be armed with, is that they do have rights. Another word that you may have heard of is whistleblower. Not a very distinctive concept, whether you say somebody's a whistleblower or whether they're victim of retaliation. It's really the same thing. So that's one part of it. The other.
But you mentioned that there needs to be some kind of law to stand on. Does that count like health orders from the county? Is that good enough to be able to come and have an action against the employer? Well,
this is what we need to see. I mean, we won't know until a court makes a ruling. That's how we rely on precedent to figure out the interpretation of common law, because retaliation is a common law theory. It's not one that's based in statute, except with the few exceptions that we don't need to go into here. There are some. But what we're talking about here is going to require a court to say, yes, this particular city ordinance, county ordinance, state ordinance, or even federal regulation amounts to a law that is there for the public benefit. Because that's the other thing. Sometimes people come to me and they'll say, Susan, I was retaliated against because I complained about the way that my boss, did a PowerPoint or whatever it might be. Not something that rises to the level of a legal issue.
Exactly.
So you have to have something that actually is a law that's there for the public benefit. And I can't think of anything that's more there for the public benefit right now than these COVID prevention, procedures. So I think absolutely there's going to be a lot of law made, lawyers are going to stay busy with retaliation cases.
Right. I think you're absolutely true. Any parting advice?
Be patient. I think that we started this talking about how for some of us this is a difficult time, but even for me as an extrovert who misses the human connections, I'm finding new ways to connect. I have a Monday social group that we do Zoom, and I'm ending up interacting with some friends more often because of it, right? Because I wasn't seeing my friends every Monday, So I think that there's some real upside to this time if you embrace it. But in terms of legal rights, there's a lot of information you can find on the internet, but of course it can be confusing. It cannot always be accurate. So lawyers like myself are made for this moment. We're here to help and give people guidance as they return to work safely.
Fantastic, Susan. I appreciate the time you spent with us today. If there's an employee out there who has some question and wants to contact you, what is the best way to reach you?
So they can go to my website, and then they'll learn more about our firm, our testimonials about our happy clients, and the breadth of our experience. And that's at bluerlaw.com. So my last name, which is BLUERLAW.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Susan. Hope you stay safe and take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been great to work with you and talk with you today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Wong of Viridian Mortgage, and welcome to Ask and Answered. a video series that I created highlighting mostly attorneys dealing with COVID pandemic-related issues. In this day and age of constantly streaming information at our fingertips, it's sometimes easy to fall prey to sensory overload. And so the goal of this program is to hear firsthand from those professionals who are the experts dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis and providing us with the clarity and direction we need during these challenging times. Thank you for watching. Be smart, stay safe, and take care.